Come with me, the little black girl said. The billionaire was speechless when he heard it. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night was cold, with the faint hum of the city fading into the distance, replaced only by the rustle of wind through the trees. Outside a towering luxury building, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Its polished exterior gleamed under the streetlights, reflecting the quiet intensity of the night. A billionaire, Ethan Caldwell, stepped out of the car, his mind consumed with the usual worries of his high-profile life, deals to close, meetings to attend, and the ever-present pressure of his reputation. He didn't notice her at first. She was small, barely 7, standing at the entrance to the building, her worn shoes scraping against the pavement. Her hair, braided tightly into rows, framed her face, but it was the sadness in her eyes that caught Ethan's attention. He stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing as he looked at her. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, though he was still lost in his thoughts. The little girl didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked up at him, her big eyes full of something Ethan couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Determination? Hope? "Come with me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it felt like a command. Ethan blinked, taken aback. He glanced around, making sure there was no one else, but there was no one nearby. Just the girl, standing there, looking up at him as though she had no doubt in the world that he would follow her. "What?" he asked, a little confused. She didn't answer right away, but took a small step closer to him, her eyes unwavering. "Come with me. You're not supposed to be alone," she said again, this time more firmly. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to make sense of the situation. He was used to being approached by people asking for money or favors, but there was something about her that made him stop. I can't," he said, instinctively trying to pull away, his mind already back on his responsibilities. But the girl wasn't done. "You're alone, too," she said softly, her words catching him off guard. The statement hit harder than he expected. She was right. Ethan had spent years building his empire, yet his life was as empty as it was full. His mind raced with thoughts of his family, or rather, the lack of one. He had never really felt the need for one. Not until this moment. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, and for a second, he felt something stir within him. A fleeting sense of connection. "Why do you say that?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost searching for something in her response. The little girl didn't hesitate. "I know," she said simply, stepping closer, her small hand reaching out to touch his sleeve. "I can feel it." Ethan stood still, caught in her gaze. He felt his heart beat faster, but not from the anxiety of his usual busy life. It was something else, something deeper. "You're not alone," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, something in him shifted. Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire who had everything and yet nothing, followed the little black girl into the unknown. The night had just begun, and little did he know, it would change everything. The little girl led Ethan through the quiet streets, her pace slow but steady, as if she knew exactly where they were going. Ethan followed her, his mind still reeling from the strange encounter. There was something about her, something both unsettling and comforting at the same time. The city around them was bustling with life, but here, in the shadows of the towering buildings, it felt as though time had slowed down. The girl walked with an air of quiet confidence, as if she had seen more than any child her age should. Ethan couldn't help but wonder who she was and what had brought her here, in front of him, in this very moment. "Where are we going?" he finally asked, his voice soft, almost afraid to break the fragile silence that had settled between them. She glanced up at him, her brown eyes locking onto his for a brief moment before she looked ahead again. "To a place where no one will hurt you," she replied, her words carrying a weight that Ethan couldn't quite grasp. "A place where you don't have to be alone." Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, an undercurrent of truth that made him stop and think. He hadn't realized how much he'd been living in isolation until now. Sure, he had his work, his wealth, his status. But none of that made him feel truly connected to anyone, not in the way that this little girl seemed to be. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the ground as they walked. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, studying the way she moved, graceful, yet deliberate. Her clothes were worn, a stark contrast to the polished suits he was used to seeing in his world. Still, there was something regal about her. "Why me?" he asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Why did you choose me to follow?" The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, she stopped in front of a small, unassuming building. It was nothing like the towering mansions or grand office buildings that filled the city, but there was a quiet dignity to it. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Because you're just like me," she said simply. "You're looking for something." Ethan felt a pang in his chest. She was right. He had been searching for something his whole life, something real, something meaningful, but he had never known how to find it. His whole life had been a carefully crafted illusion of success. His business empire, his wealth, his influence, they were all just distractions, keeping him from facing the truth that he had been running from for years. The girl stepped forward and placed a small hand on the door of the building, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the wood. "Come inside," she said softly, almost as if it were an invitation he couldn't refuse. Ethan hesitated for a moment, looking at the door, then back at her. She was waiting, her eyes calm and steady. Without a word, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door. As the door creaked open, a warm light spilled out, spilling into the cold night air. The contrast between the harsh city and this small, humble place felt like stepping into another world. Inside, the room was simple, yet inviting. A small fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ethan's eyes scanned the room, landing on a woman sitting by the fire, her face hidden in the glow of the flames. She looked up as they entered, her eyes filled with an unreadable expression. The girl walked toward her, her footsteps light and almost inaudible. "She's here," the girl said, her voice carrying a sense of finality. The woman smiled, though it was a sad smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You found him," she said, her voice soft but filled with a depth that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "It's time for the truth to come out." Ethan looked at the woman, his heart pounding in his chest. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something much larger than himself. He didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. He was no longer just the billionaire. He was about to become part of something far greater than his own success. Something that would force him to confront his past, his mistakes, and the truth about who he really was. The little girl stood beside him, her hand still resting lightly on the door, watching him with quiet assurance. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm ready." And with that, the door closed behind him, and the journey began. The door closed softly behind Ethan as he stepped fully into the warm, dimly lit room. The scent of wood smoke and something sweet lingered in the air, but it wasn't the scent that lingered in his mind. It was the feeling that had begun to settle inside him. This place was not like the cold, sterile offices he was accustomed to, with their clean lines and carefully curated designs. It was messy in its own way, but comforting. There was something real here, something honest. He stood still for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the firelight that flickered against the walls. The room felt like it was frozen in time, tucked away from the world outside. The little girl had already moved to sit near the fire, her small form curled up on an old armchair. Ethan glanced at the woman, who had risen to greet him. She was older, with a soft face that bore the signs of a hard life. Yet her eyes held a kindness that was impossible to ignore. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself as much as to him. Her voice was steady but filled with something unspoken, a quiet weight behind every word. Ethan nodded but didn't speak right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He was out of his element here, in a place where the truth was far simpler, but somehow harder to face. The girl's quiet voice broke the silence before he could gather his thoughts. "I knew you would come," she said, not looking up from the small object in her hands. Ethan watched her for a moment. She was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper, the edges frayed as though it had been carried around for a long time. She looked at it with a mix of reverence and sadness. What's that? Ethan asked, stepping closer. The girl finally looked up, her big eyes meeting his. There was a seriousness in her gaze now, one that made him pause. This is how I found you, she said softly, handing him the paper. Ethan took it carefully, unfolding the worn edges. As he read, his heart began to race. The words were simple, but they hit him harder than he expected. You are needed. Come, when you hear her voice. The message was cryptic, but he knew, deep down, that it was meant for him. He glanced at the woman, but she only gave him a small nod, confirming what he already knew. Who wrote this? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman walked over to him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Someone who knew what was to come, she said. Someone who wanted to make sure you heard the call. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. The weight of the moment, the realization that this was more than a simple coincidence, was heavy. But why me? He asked, his voice shaking with confusion and disbelief. The woman's gaze softened. Because you've been lost for too long, Ethan, she said gently. You've been living your life running from something, without realizing it. She's here to remind you of what you've forgotten. Ethan turned back to the girl, whose eyes were still locked onto his. Her face was serene, but there was a quiet intensity in the way she looked at him, as though she had known all along what was going to happen. You know more than you're telling me, Ethan said, his voice firm now. The girl nodded slowly, standing up from her chair. I know that you've spent your whole life chasing things that don't matter, she said, her words surprisingly wise for someone so young. But I also know that you can change. That's why I'm here. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing with questions. Who was this girl? How did she know so much about him? And what was the truth she was talking about? You're not the only one who's lost, the girl continued, her gaze shifting to the woman by the fire. But you can be the one who finds it. Ethan felt a jolt of realization. It was like a light had switched on inside him, and for the first time, he could see clearly. This moment, this strange encounter, was not an accident. It was the beginning of something much larger. The woman spoke again, her voice low but filled with emotion. You've been searching for meaning, Ethan, but you've been looking in all the wrong places. It's not about the money, or the deals, or the power. It's about something much more important. She paused, her gaze holding his, and then she said, it's about connection. It's about family. It's about love. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of something real pressing against his chest. He had spent so long focusing on the things that didn't matter that he had forgotten the most important thing of all. I don't know how to fix this, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to start. The woman smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. It's simple, she said. You start by listening. You start by being open to what you've been running from. And then you make a choice. Ethan looked at the little girl again, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that he couldn't ignore. What's the choice? He asked, his heart racing. She walked closer to him, her small hand resting lightly on his arm. You choose to believe in what you can't see, she said softly. You choose to believe that you're not alone. And then you choose to love. Ethan looked at the paper in his hand again, the words lingering in his mind. You are needed. Come, when you hear her voice. He knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when everything in his life would change. And he was ready. The fire crackled in the corner as Ethan stood quietly, still processing the words that had been spoken. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, her words both comforting and unsettling. He had been searching for something real, but the truth she had revealed was more than he had ever anticipated. The little girl, still standing by the fire, watched him carefully, as if she could read the thoughts swirling inside his head. Ethan felt a sense of urgency building inside him, a need to understand everything that was happening. He had always prided himself on being in control, but tonight, everything fell out of his hands. The woman finally broke the silence. I know this is a lot to take in, she said softly, her tone calm, yet filled with an undeniable weight. But sometimes, we have to lose ourselves before we can truly find what matters. Ethan turned to look at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. Lose myself? He asked. The woman nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, you've spent so long building your empire, creating a life that looks perfect on the outside. But inside, you've been hollow. You've been running from something, Ethan, you've been hiding from the truth of who you are and what you really need. Ethan's heart raced. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He had always believed that success was the answer to everything, that if he could just keep moving forward, keep pushing harder, he would find fulfillment. But now, standing here in this small room, with the girl and the woman, he realized how empty that path had been. The little girl spoke up again, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to do this alone, she said. Ethan turned to face her, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. You've been chasing the wrong things. You've been looking for meaning in all the wrong places. The words stung, but they also felt like the truth. For the first time, Ethan was faced with the reality that his wealth, his achievements, had not brought him happiness. He had built an empire, but it was built on sand. What do I do now? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman stepped closer, her presence comforting. You start by letting go of the things that weigh you down. You start by accepting help, by trusting the people who truly see you. And you begin by making choices that come from the heart, not the head. Ethan's mind swirled with doubt and fear. He had spent his life making decisions based on logic, on what made the most sense financially, on what kept him in control. But now, everything had changed. The little girl reached out and took his hand, her small fingers gripping his tightly. You don't have to be afraid, she said softly. You've already taken the first step. Ethan looked down at her, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't expected. He had been afraid to trust, afraid to let go of the life he had built. But now, standing here with her, he realized that the only way forward was to trust. To trust her, to trust the woman, and, most importantly, to trust himself. The weight of his past, the endless chase for success, the loneliness, the isolation, felt lighter somehow. It was as if, in this small, humble room, a new chapter was beginning. The little girl smiled up at him, her eyes filled with hope. You're not alone anymore, she said. Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. He had been running from something for so long, but now, he was ready to face it. The woman gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with understanding. This is just the beginning, she said. But you're ready. You've always been ready. Ethan felt a surge of determination rise up within him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything changed. He had spent so long trying to fill the emptiness with things that didn't matter. But now he understood. It wasn't about what he had or what he could achieve. It was about connection. It was about love. And it was about finally being honest with himself. He turned to the little girl, his heart full. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've shown me something I didn't know I needed. She smiled, her small hand still resting in his. You'll see, she said quietly. There's so much more waiting for you. Ethan looked out the window, the city lights shining in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer alone. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. The following morning, Ethan found himself standing in front of a large, glossy mirror in a room that felt too quiet. The sunlight was streaming in through the windows, casting a soft golden glow across the floor. He could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but it felt miles away. He had never been the type to dwell on the little details of his life, but this room, with its muted tones and minimalist decor, felt foreign. It felt too still. His gaze wandered to the window, where the world outside seemed to be carrying on as usual. People hurrying to work, cars honking, the buzz of daily life continuing without a second thought. But for Ethan, it was as if time had stopped. He was no longer just the billionaire. He was someone else now, someone who had to face things he had been running from for years. The little girl's words echoed in his mind. You don't have to be alone anymore. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was floating through life. He felt rooted, like the world around him had become real again. Just as he was about to turn away from the window, he heard a soft knock on the door. The girl appeared, her presence calm, almost like she had been waiting for him. Her eyes, always so steady, seemed to carry an understanding far beyond her years. You're up early, she said quietly, her voice as soft as it had been the night before. Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Couldn't sleep, he replied, his voice strained. Too much on my mind. She stepped into the room, her small figure barely making a sound as she walked. "It's okay," she said, offering him a smile that, somehow, made everything feel lighter. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his whole life thinking that success meant shouldering everything alone, never asking for help, never letting anyone in. But now, standing in front of this girl, this child who had shown him more kindness than anyone ever had, he realized just how wrong he had been. "I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The girl walked over to him, standing in front of him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "You start by believing that you can," she said simply. Ethan looked down at her, his heart heavy with emotion. "I've spent so long running from the truth," he said softly. "I don't know how to face it." The girl's expression softened, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. "It's not about facing it alone," she said. "You don't have to be afraid." Her words were like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he didn't feel so alone. The woman, who had been silently watching from across the room, now stepped forward. Her eyes met Ethan's, filled with something he couldn't quite place: sympathy, understanding, maybe even a little hope. "You've already taken the hardest step," she said quietly. "You've opened your heart to what's real." Ethan nodded, still unsure of what came next. His life had always been about control, about managing every aspect of his existence to ensure that nothing slipped through his fingers. But now, nothing felt within his control. Not the girl, not the woman, not even his own emotions. "What now?" he asked. The woman smiled softly, her gaze kind but knowing. "Now, you learn to trust. Trust in yourself, and trust in the people around you." The girl nodded in agreement. "It's a journey," she said, "and it's not going to be easy. But you'll be okay. You'll see." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling something inside him shift. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what was coming. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he knew he couldn't keep running. He had to face what he had been avoiding for so long. "I've been so focused on building things," he said, his voice quieter now. "I forgot what it was like to feel anything." The woman's gaze softened. "It's never too late to start," she said. "You've built so much, Ethan. But the most important thing you can build now is your own peace." Ethan looked down at the girl, who was watching him with quiet encouragement. "And how do I do that?" he asked, his voice filled with vulnerability. The girl smiled, her small face filled with quiet wisdom. "You start by being kind to yourself," she said gently. "And then, you let others in." Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a weight he hadn't realized he had been carrying. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to look for them. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The little girl smiled up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're welcome," she said softly. And in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The following morning, Ethan sat at the small wooden table in the corner of the room, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him. The warm steam curled up into the air, but he didn't touch it. His thoughts were too scattered, too heavy to focus on something as simple as a cup of coffee. His mind was consumed by everything that had happened in the last few days, everything that had shifted in his life. The little girl, whose name he still didn't know, had completely changed his perspective. She had brought him into a world he never thought he'd be a part of, a world of honesty, vulnerability, and connection. He had spent his life building walls around himself. Walls that kept people at a distance, walls that allowed him to control every part of his life. But now, those walls were crumbling. The woman had told him it was time to trust, time to face what he had been avoiding. But how could he trust when he had spent so long hiding from the truth? How could he believe that this was real, that this small, unassuming place could be the beginning of something new? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. He looked up, startled, unsure of who it could be. He had become so used to the silence, to the solitude, that the thought of someone else entering his space felt alien. The door creaked open, and there she was. The little girl, standing in the doorway, her small face serious but kind. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with an unspoken understanding. Ethan nodded, too stunned to speak. She stepped into the room, her presence filling the space in a way that made everything else seem unimportant. She walked over to the table where he sat and stood there for a moment, looking at him, her eyes filled with something beyond her years. "You look worried," she said gently, her tone light but perceptive. Ethan laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I guess I've got a lot on my mind," he said, though the words felt hollow. How could he explain the whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that had overtaken him? How could he put into words the feeling of having his whole world turned upside down by a small child? The girl sat down across from him, her legs swinging slightly from the edge of the chair. She looked at him with a steady gaze, as though she knew exactly what he was thinking. "You're afraid," she said simply. Ethan looked at her, surprised by her insight. "Afraid of what?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Afraid of what comes next," she said, her words hanging in the air. "But you don't have to be. You just have to trust." Her words were simple, but they hit him harder than he expected. He had spent his whole life avoiding trust, keeping his distance from anyone who might make him vulnerable. But here she was, telling him that the answer was as simple as trusting. Ethan let out a slow breath, trying to process everything she was saying. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his voice shaky. The girl's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "Because I know," she said, her voice full of certainty. "I know that you're ready. You've already made the hardest decision. You came here. You listened." Ethan stared at her, his heart racing. For a moment, he felt like he was seeing her for the first time, not just as a child, but as someone who had the ability to see through all the walls he had built. He had never let anyone in before, but this girl, this child, had already seen the truth in him. "You're not alone anymore," she continued, her voice steady and kind. "You have us now, and you don't have to keep running. You can choose to stay." Her words, simple and direct, echoed in his mind. He could choose. For the first time in his life, he realized that he had the power to choose his own path. He didn't have to be the man he had spent so many years pretending to be. He didn't have to chase success or control anymore. He could choose something else. The thought made his chest tighten, but in a way that felt freeing. "What if I'm not ready?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl smiled softly, her eyes full of compassion. "You don't have to be ready," she said. "You just have to start." Ethan looked at her, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and fear. He had always thought he had to have everything figured out, that he had to be prepared for every eventuality. But now, standing here in front of this child, he understood that sometimes you just had to take the first step, without knowing what would come next. The woman entered the room then, her presence calm and steady. She walked over to Ethan and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "It's time, Ethan," she said softly. "It's time to make the choice." Ethan nodded, his heart racing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. He had already made the first step. He had come here. He had listened. And now, it was time to trust. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." And with those words, the next chapter of his life began, not with a grand plan, but with a simple, trusting step forward. The days that followed felt different for Ethan. It wasn't just that he was living in a new space, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. It was the way his mind had started to change. The walls he had spent so many years building, the walls that had kept his emotions at bay, were crumbling. The little girl, whose name he still didn't know, had shown him that there was more to life than the cold, calculated success he had built. She had shown him the possibility of connection, of vulnerability, of trust. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was waking up. He had always been proud of the empire he had built, the wealth, the status, the power. But now, in the quiet moments of reflection, he could see how hollow it had all been. There was no real warmth in his life, no real connection to the people around him. He had been too focused on the wrong things, too focused on keeping control. But that was changing now. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. One afternoon, as Ethan sat by the fire in the small room, the little girl entered, holding something in her hand. It was a piece of paper, torn at the edges and faded with age. She walked over to him and held it out. "This was my grandmother's," she said quietly. "She told me it was important." Ethan took the paper, his fingers brushing against the delicate edges. He unfolded it carefully, his heart beating faster as he read the words. "You are needed. Come, when you hear her voice." The message was simple, but the impact it had on Ethan was profound. This wasn't just a piece of paper. This was a connection to something bigger than himself. This was the answer to everything he had been searching for. Who wrote this? He asked, looking up at the girl. She sat beside him, her eyes serious. My grandmother, she said. She worked for you a long time ago. She knew what would happen. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a wave. This girl, this child, was connected to him in ways he hadn't even imagined. The woman who had brought him to this place, the woman who had given him the courage to face his fears, had been part of his life long before he even knew it. He had been searching for answers, but the answers had always been there, waiting for him to see them. She knew me? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded. She said you would forget. She said you would need someone to remind you. The weight of the words settled over him. He had spent so long running from the truth, so long avoiding the things that mattered most. But now, the truth was staring him in the face. He had been given a second chance. He had been given the opportunity to make things right. What do I do now? Ethan asked, his voice shaky. The girl smiled, her small hand resting gently on his. You start by listening, she said softly. And then you make the choice. Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. She had shown him the way. She had opened his eyes to the possibilities he had never considered. And now, it was up to him to make the choice. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The journey had just begun. And for the first time, he was ready. He looked down at the piece of paper in his hand, the words written in a hand that had long since faded. He could hear the voice of the woman in his mind, her words clear and true. You are needed. Come, when you hear her voice. The voice had always been there, waiting for him to listen. And now he had. Ethan stood up, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The girl stood beside him, her small hand resting in his, her eyes filled with quiet assurance. You've made the right choice, she said, her voice full of confidence. Ethan smiled, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he was running anymore. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, and that was enough. The days that followed felt like a slow awakening for Ethan. The choices he had made were starting to take root, and with each passing moment, he felt less like the billionaire he once was and more like someone who was finally finding his way. The little girl, who had shown him so much, seemed to know exactly what he needed before he even realized it himself. Every time they spoke, it felt like a piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The woman, who had helped guide him, was becoming more of a fixture in his life, and he couldn't help but feel a connection to both of them that went beyond anything he had ever experienced before. One afternoon, after spending some time with the girl and the woman, Ethan found himself alone again in the small, dimly lit room. His mind was racing with thoughts about what he should do next, but there was a sense of peace in him now that hadn't existed before. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to control every outcome. He was simply letting life unfold. As the evening settled in, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the girl, her small frame appearing in the doorway, her face soft and full of understanding. She looked at him for a moment, and then her eyes softened. You're thinking again, she said quietly, her voice gentle. Ethan smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. It's hard to stop thinking, he replied, his voice quieter than usual. I've spent so long trying to figure everything out. I don't know how to just let go. The girl stepped into the room and sat down next to him, her presence calm and steady. It's okay to let go, she said. You don't have to have all the answers. Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. But I've always had to have answers. I've always had to know what was next. The girl nodded, as though she understood. But you don't have to anymore, she said softly. You can choose to just be. You've already made the hardest choice. Now you just need to let it happen. Ethan felt the weight of her words. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he had been so focused on controlling everything that he had forgotten how to live. He had forgotten how to just be in the moment, to trust that things would work out without his constant interference. I don't know how to do that, he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. The girl looked at him, her gaze steady and kind. You don't have to know how, she said. You just have to trust that it will come. Trust that you're on the right path. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a knot in his throat. He had spent his whole life building something, but he had never built anything that truly mattered. Now, standing here with this little girl, he realized that all the things he had worked for were empty without the connection he had been searching for. I think I'm scared, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Scared of what comes next. The girl smiled softly, her small hand resting gently on his arm. It's okay to be scared, she said. But don't let that stop you. Don't let fear hold you back from what's waiting for you. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He was terrified of what lay ahead, terrified of letting go and trusting that everything would work out. But at the same time, there was a part of him that knew she was right. He had spent so long controlling everything, so long being the one who had all the answers. Maybe it was time to let go. Maybe it was time to stop fighting the flow of life. I don't know if I can, he said softly, his voice barely audible. The girl squeezed his arm gently, her voice filled with reassurance. You can, she said. You've already done the hardest part. You just need to believe. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight in his chest lightening ever so slightly. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. With her by his side, with the woman's gentle guidance, he didn't feel so alone. For the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew that he could take it, one step at a time, without the need to control everything. He could just let go. And that, he realized, was the most freeing feeling of all. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to feel the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, though he knew the journey was far from over. The little girl had been right. He had started by trusting, by letting go of the walls that had kept him isolated for so long. And now, every day, he was learning how to be present, how to connect with people in ways he had never allowed himself to before. The little girl had brought him into a new world, a world of kindness, vulnerability, and most importantly, truth. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan found himself walking through the quiet neighborhood with the little girl by his side. They had been talking about nothing in particular, just the world around them, the people they had met, the things they had seen. It was a normal conversation, but it felt different. There was a sense of ease between them now, an unspoken understanding that had developed over time. Ethan had never experienced anything like it before. He had always been surrounded by people, but he had never felt truly seen. The little girl had done that for him. You've changed, she said, her voice soft as they walked. Ethan smiled, though he didn't say anything at first. She was right. He had changed. Everything he had thought he knew about success, about happiness, had been turned upside down. I feel like I'm waking up, he replied after a moment, his voice full of wonder. Like I'm finally seeing things for what they are. The girl nodded, as though she understood exactly what he meant. That's what happens when you let go of all the things that don't matter, she said. You start to see what's real. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time, he realized just how much he had been missing in his life. He had spent so many years focusing on the wrong things, chasing after power, money, and success, without ever considering what really mattered. But now, as he walked beside this little girl, he understood that the things he had once believed to be important were nothing compared to the connections he had begun to form. As they walked, the sounds of the city faded into the background, and Ethan found himself lost in the quiet moments. He had never felt more alive than he did right now, with this girl, in this moment. The weight of his past seemed so far away. They turned a corner and stopped in front of a small park, where a few children were playing. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with excitement. Do you want to watch them? She asked. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. Sure, he said, sitting down on a nearby bench. For the next few minutes, they sat together, watching the children run around, laughing and playing without a care in the world. It was simple, but it was beautiful. And in that moment, Ethan realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. This was the kind of connection he had needed. It wasn't about the high-powered meetings, or the fancy cars, or the accolades. It was about the small, quiet moments. It was about being present. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Ethan turned to the girl, his heart full. Thank you, he said, his voice full of emotion. For everything. You've shown me something I never knew I needed. The girl looked at him, her expression serene. I didn't do anything, she said softly. You found it yourself. You just had to be willing to see it. Ethan nodded, feeling a tear slip down his cheek. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready to face whatever came next, because he knew he wasn't alone. As they walked back toward the small building where they had made their home, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had learned so much in such a short time, and he knew there was still more to learn. But one thing was certain: he was no longer the man he had been. He had been given a second chance, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The weeks passed, and Ethan found himself slowly adjusting to his new life, a life that was no longer defined by the cold, distant world of power and wealth he had once known. His days were different now, marked by small moments of connection and clarity that had once felt so far out of reach. The little girl had shown him the way, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly living. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Ethan, that was enough. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, watching the children play and listening to the sound of their laughter, Ethan felt something shift inside of him. He had been so focused on the idea of success for so long, but now, he understood something deeper. Success wasn't about the number of buildings he owned or the wealth he accumulated. It wasn't about control or power. Success was about connection, about love, and about making a difference in the world. The little girl had shown him that. And now, sitting in the quiet of the park, he realized that he wanted to be a part of something bigger. He wanted to help others, to be there for people in the way that the little girl had been there for him. He looked over at her, her small face filled with innocence and hope. She had given him so much more than he had ever expected. She had opened his eyes to the world around him and showed him the beauty in simple things. Ethan had always thought that he was the one who needed to fix things, that he was the one who had to be strong and in control. But now, he understood that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is to let go, to trust, to allow yourself to be vulnerable. He smiled at her, his heart full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. The girl looked up at him with her steady gaze, her eyes filled with wisdom beyond her years. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You've already done the hard part. You chose to open your heart. That's all that matters." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He had spent so many years pushing people away, building walls around himself to keep others out. But now, he was learning how to let those walls down. And with each step he took, he felt lighter. He felt free. The woman, who had been quietly observing from a distance, walked over to them, her presence calm and reassuring. She had been a steady force in his life, guiding him through this journey and showing him the path forward. "You've come so far, Ethan," she said, her voice warm. "I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never felt so seen, so understood. For the first time, he wasn't just the billionaire. He was a person, a real person with flaws and fears and hopes. And that was enough. The girl stood up, her small hand reaching out to him. "Come on," she said, her voice light and playful. "Let's go do something fun." Ethan chuckled, standing up and brushing the dirt off his pants. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "You'll see," she said with a grin, leading him toward the swings. As they walked, Ethan felt a sense of joy bubbling up inside him. It wasn't the kind of joy he had gotten from making deals or closing a big contract. It was the kind of joy that came from being present, from experiencing life as it was, in all its imperfect beauty. They reached the swings, and the girl hopped onto one, her feet barely touching the ground as she swung back and forth. Ethan stood beside her, watching her with a smile on his face. He couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder at how far he had come. From the man who had once been consumed by his empire, to the man who now found joy in the simplest moments. "This is what it's all about," he said softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "This is what I've been missing." The little girl stopped swinging and turned to look at him, her eyes filled with something like pride. "You're finally seeing it," she said. "You're finally seeing what's real." Ethan nodded, his heart full. He had spent so long looking for meaning in all the wrong places. But now, he knew that meaning was not something you could find through wealth or power. It was something that came from connection, from love, and from the simple act of being present with the people who mattered. "Thank you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." The girl smiled, her eyes full of warmth. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice gentle. "You found it yourself. I just helped you remember." Ethan watched her for a moment, a sense of peace settling over him. He wasn't the man he had been before. He was someone new, someone better. And for the first time, he was ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he was no longer afraid to take the next step. With the little girl by his side, and the woman who had guided him, Ethan knew that he could face anything. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all. Days passed, and Ethan's life continued to transform in ways he never thought possible. Each day was a small step toward understanding, toward learning to live in a world that wasn't governed by his previous rules of wealth and success. The little girl had helped him unlock a side of himself that had been buried beneath layers of ambition and pride for so long. She had given him the courage to open up, to trust, and to feel. But as time went on, something unexpected began to stir within him. The connection that he had started to form with the little girl, and with the woman who had guided him, was starting to open up a deeper truth, a truth he wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just about trusting others. It was about trusting himself, trusting that he could be the kind of person who made a real difference. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man of action. He had built an empire, taken risks, and fought for his place in the world. But now, standing in front of the woman and the little girl, he realized that all the actions he had taken before had been for the wrong reasons. They had been driven by fear and insecurity. They had been driven by a desire to prove himself, to prove his worth. But now, with everything changing around him, he knew that his actions had to come from a different place. They had to come from a place of authenticity, of love, and of purpose. One evening, as they all sat together around the small table, the little girl turned to him, her eyes full of understanding. "You're thinking again," she said softly. Ethan smiled, a little sheepish. "I guess I am," he replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But this time, it's different." The woman, who had been silently observing, looked at him with kind eyes. "You've come a long way, Ethan," she said. "But now, it's time to face the next step. The hardest part of this journey is the moment when you realize that you're the one who has to change. You're the one who has to make the choice to act differently." Ethan nodded slowly. He knew she was right. The hardest part wasn't the realization of what needed to be done. It was the action, the decision to live in a way that was consistent with the person he was becoming. The little girl, sensing his hesitation, stood up and walked over to him. She reached out her hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. "You're not alone in this," she said simply. "We're with you." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of those words. He wasn't alone. And for the first time, he knew he didn't have to do everything on his own. He didn't have to fight the world by himself. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The little girl smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're welcome," she said softly. "Now, let's go make a difference." The next day, Ethan made a decision. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a sweeping change of direction that would shock the world. It was a quiet, personal decision to start living differently. He didn't know what that would look like yet, but he knew that it had to start with a choice. A choice to stop pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. A choice to stop running from the truth of who he was. A choice to be present in his own life, to really experience it, rather than just pass through it. And so, with that choice, everything began to shift. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but it was enough. Ethan began reaching out to the people who had once been distant to him, his employees, his colleagues, even strangers. He started to make a point of listening to them, of seeing them, of being present in their lives. Slowly, he began to change the way he interacted with the world around him. He found himself laughing more, enjoying the small moments, and not worrying so much about the bigger picture. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan realized something incredible. He wasn't just changing his actions. He was changing his heart. The walls he had built up for so long were falling down, and in their place, something new was taking shape. A life of purpose, of connection, of love. He was no longer the man he had once been. He was becoming the man he had always wanted to be, the man who could make a real difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. One evening, as he walked through the city, he passed by the small park where he and the little girl had once sat. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the scene. Ethan stopped for a moment, taking in the beauty of it all. He realized that, for the first time, he was truly seeing the world around him. And he was grateful. He was grateful for the little girl, for the woman who had guided him, and for the journey that had led him here. But most of all, he was grateful for the choice he had made, to stop running, to stop hiding, and to start living. And in that moment, he knew that the best was yet to come. The days that followed felt like a blur to Ethan. There was so much to absorb, so much to unlearn, but as the weeks passed, something inside of him began to shift. He no longer rushed through life as he once had, consumed by the constant need to prove himself. Instead, he found himself savoring small moments with the little girl, with the woman, and even with himself. The weight that had once held him down was slowly being lifted, and with it came a sense of peace that Ethan had never known. One evening, after spending the afternoon walking through the city, he found himself sitting on a bench in the park, watching the sun set over the horizon. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed everything in a soft glow, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt still. He wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next meeting. He wasn't worried about the future. He was just there, in that moment. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" the little girl said, her voice soft but clear. Ethan turned to look at her. She had appeared beside him, as if she had been there all along, even though he hadn't noticed her approach. Her small frame was silhouetted against the fading light, and her eyes sparkled with the same quiet wisdom they always held. "It really is," Ethan replied, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't think I've ever really noticed it before." The girl nodded, her expression knowing. "We don't always see things, do we?" she said. "Sometimes, we're so focused on the big things that we forget to look at the small ones." Ethan's smile faded slightly as her words sank in. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing after success, climbing ladders, and building empires, all the while missing out on the things that truly mattered. The little girl's simple words seemed to strike him more profoundly than any business deal or negotiation ever had. He had been so focused on building a life that he hadn't stopped to look at the life he was already living. "I think I've spent my whole life looking for something, but never really knowing what it was," Ethan said, his voice quiet. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes, you just have to stop looking for it," she said, "and let it find you." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He had spent so many years running, trying to control everything, trying to make life into something it was never meant to be. But now, as he sat there beside the little girl, he realized that he had been missing the point all along. Life wasn't about control. It wasn't about achievements or success. It was about connection. It was about being present and letting go of the need to always have the answers. He looked out over the park, the soft hum of the city in the background. The sun had almost set, casting long shadows across the ground. And for the first time, he felt completely at peace. The woman had once told him that the hardest part of this journey would be facing the truth. But as he sat there, looking at the little girl beside him, he realized that he had already faced it. He had already chosen to change. And now, he could let go of the need to fix everything. He could simply be. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've helped me see what I've been missing." The little girl smiled, her eyes soft and filled with quiet pride. "I didn't do much," she said. "You just needed someone to show you the way." Ethan shook his head, his heart full. "No," he said. "You did everything. You showed me that it's okay to be vulnerable. You showed me that it's okay to trust." She smiled again, her expression warm. "That's what we all need to learn," she said softly. "To trust." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with acceptance, and with the knowledge that this was the beginning of something new, something better. "You've made the right choice," the woman said, her voice appearing from behind them. Ethan turned to see her standing a few feet away, her presence calm and steady. "It's not going to be easy," she continued. "But the most important thing is that you've taken the first step." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. The path ahead wasn't going to be simple, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was simply going to walk the path, step by step. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The woman gave him a soft smile, her eyes filled with warmth. "You don't need to thank me," she said gently. "You've already done the hardest part. Now, just keep moving forward." And as they stood there together, watching the final moments of the sunset, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The future was still uncertain, but it was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. And for the first time, he was ready to embrace it, fully and without hesitation. As Ethan walked through the city that evening, the feeling of peace he had found in the past few days began to feel fragile. Something was shifting, something he couldn't yet grasp, but knew was there, lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't fear, exactly, at least, not the kind of fear he was used to. This was different. It was a quiet, persistent unease, as though he was standing at the edge of something new, something unknown. The little girl, who had been so much of the catalyst for his change, was walking beside him. Her steps were light, her eyes focused ahead, but she was always attuned to him. "You're thinking again," she said, not looking at him, but somehow knowing. Ethan gave a small laugh, trying to shake off the feeling. "It's hard not to," he replied. "I guess I'm just trying to figure things out." She nodded, though her gaze never wavered from the path ahead. "You don't need to figure everything out," she said. "You've already made the hardest decision." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had made a decision. He had chosen to stop running. He had chosen to live in the moment, to embrace the truth, but now that it was becoming real, he wasn't sure where it would take him. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice quieter now, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. The little girl finally turned to look at him, her expression soft. "It's okay to be scared," she said, her voice steady. "You can be scared and still move forward." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket. She was right. He had been scared for so long, afraid of failing, afraid of letting go, but the truth was, he had already started moving forward. The little girl had helped him see that. It was time to stop holding back. Time to stop being afraid of what might come next. "But how do I know I'm doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice shaky, but more from uncertainty than fear. She smiled, the soft, reassuring smile he had seen so many times before. "You don't need to know everything," she said. "The right thing isn't always the easiest thing. Sometimes it's about trusting that you're on the right path, even when you can't see the end of it." Ethan took a deep breath, letting the weight of her words settle into his bones. He had spent his life trying to control everything, making every decision with the intent of ensuring that things would turn out the way he expected. But now he understood. The right path wasn't about control. It was about trust. Trusting in the process, in the people around him, and in himself. As they walked, the city's hustle and bustle seemed to fade away. Ethan felt a quiet moment of clarity, like a veil lifting. For the first time, he wasn't trying to manage everything. He wasn't worried about the future. He was just walking beside this little girl, taking each step as it came. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. They stopped in front of a small cafe, the warm light from inside spilling out onto the cold sidewalk. The girl looked up at him, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "How about we grab something warm?" she asked her. Voice light. Ethan smiled, nodding. "Sounds good." They walked inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloping them, and they took a seat by the window. For a moment, it felt like the world outside had slowed down. Ethan looked around, taking in the cozy ambience, the soft hum of conversation around them. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect in its simplicity. He realized that he had been missing moments like this for years, caught up in the constant chase for more. As they sat, sipping their drinks, the girl spoke again. "It's okay not to have all the answers," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go and see what happens next." Ethan nodded slowly, his heart lightening. The uncertainty that had been gnawing at him was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what would happen next. He just needed to trust, to keep moving forward. And maybe that was enough. As they finished their drinks and left the cafe, Ethan felt a quiet resolve settle in him. The world was still uncertain, still full of challenges and unknowns, but he knew that he was no longer alone in it. The girl had helped him find a new way of seeing the world. She had shown him that life wasn't about control or perfection. It was about connection, about trusting in the journey, and about finding peace in the small, quiet moments. The next steps in his journey weren't clear, but for the first time, that was okay. He could face the unknown with hope, with trust, and with the knowledge that, no matter what, he wasn't alone. And as they walked together, side by side, through the quiet streets, Ethan knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter was waiting, one that was still full of questions, but also full of possibilities. As the days passed, Ethan found himself more settled in this new way of living, a way that was still unfamiliar, but no longer something he feared. The little girl's influence on him had been undeniable, and he began to realize just how deep her wisdom ran. She had taught him the value of presence, of letting go, and of trusting in the flow of life. Still, there were moments of doubt, moments where he questioned if he was truly making the right choices, if the path he had chosen was really the right one. It was those moments that reminded him of the woman who had been by his side from the beginning, guiding him with a steady hand and a kind heart. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, Ethan sat on the balcony of the small apartment he now called home. The city stretched out before him, the streets buzzing with activity, but there was a quiet stillness in the air around him. He leaned against the railing, taking in the view, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. The woman joined him, her presence calm and familiar. "You've been quiet today," she remarked, her voice soft but filled with a knowing tone. Ethan didn't look at her, but nodded slowly. "I'm just thinking," he said quietly. "About everything. About what's next." The woman smiled, a small, reassuring smile that made him feel less alone. "You don't have to have everything figured out," she said gently. "You've come so far already. Trust that the next step will come when it's time." Ethan took a deep breath, her words sinking in. He had been trying so hard to plan, to anticipate what would happen next, but in doing so, he had missed the very thing that had brought him peace. Living in the moment, trusting in the journey. "I guess I've been worried that I'll mess it up," he admitted, finally looking at her. "I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything. I don't know how to let go of that." The woman's expression softened. "It's not about letting go of control," she said thoughtfully. "It's about trusting that you don't have to control everything to be in control of your life." Ethan's mind raced. Trust. It was the word that had been at the core of everything he had learned, but it was also the hardest thing for him to embrace. "I've spent so long building my empire my life," he said, his voice quiet. "And now, I'm just supposed to trust?" The woman nodded. "Yes, you've built your life, but now it's time to live it. You don't have to keep fighting for something you've already earned." Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders as her words sank in. He had been fighting, pushing, striving for so long that he hadn't allowed himself to simply enjoy the life he had built. The little girl had been right all along. He didn't need to keep chasing after more. He already had enough. The woman turned and walked toward the door, pausing before she left the room. "You've already made the most important decision," she said softly. "The rest will come when you're ready." Ethan watched her go, the weight of her words lingering in the air. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. It wasn't about the things he had achieved. It was about the life he was living now, the people who were in it, the choices he made each day, and most importantly, the trust he had in himself to face whatever came next. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the balcony, Ethan made a promise to himself. He would no longer worry about what was to come. He would face it, whatever it was, with the same trust and peace that he had found in the last few weeks. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace it without fear. The little girl appeared at his side, her small hand reaching up to hold his. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, yet full of the same understanding she had shown from the very beginning. Ethan looked down at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I'm okay. I think I'm finally where I need to be." The girl smiled back, her eyes bright with something like pride. "You're getting it," she said, her words filled with quiet reassurance. Ethan nodded, his heart full. He had spent so long feeling lost, unsure of where he was headed. But now, for the first time in his life, he didn't need to know where he was going. He just needed to trust that the journey was enough. And that, he realized, was the most freeing thing of all. As time moved on, Ethan's life began to unfold in ways he had never imagined. The trust he had built with the little girl and the woman had opened doors to a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. His days were no longer filled with the rush of meetings, endless negotiations, and the constant pursuit of the next achievement. Now, each day felt like a new opportunity to learn, to grow, and to build meaningful connections. Yet, Despite the peace he had found, there were moments when old fears crept in, moments when the weight of responsibility still loomed over him, reminding him of the life he had left behind. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle above, Ethan found himself standing alone on the balcony, looking out over the city. The sounds of the bustling streets below were a far cry from the stillness he had found in the last few weeks. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see the little girl walking toward him, her gaze steady and calm, as it always was. "You look lost in thought," she said, her voice light, but filled with a depth that belied her age. Ethan smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out what comes next," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The little girl stepped closer, her presence both grounding and comforting. "You don't have to figure everything out," she said, her words simple but profound. "You just have to keep going." Ethan sighed, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He had spent so much of his life trying to control the future, trying to shape every outcome. But the truth was, he couldn't control everything. And perhaps that was what he was afraid of, letting go of that control. The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of something like understanding. "You're still afraid?" she said softly. Ethan didn't answer right away, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. He was afraid. Afraid of the unknown, afraid of stepping into a future that didn't have clear answers, afraid of trusting that it would all work out. "It's okay to be afraid," she continued, her voice reassuring. "But you can't let fear control you. You have to trust that you'll be okay, no matter what." Ethan's heart tightened at her words. He had spent so long living in a world where control was everything. But now, he was learning that there was power in letting go, in trusting. "But what if I'm wrong?" he asked. Quietly, the girl smiled up at him, her gaze full of gentle wisdom. "What if you're right?" she asked. "What if everything works out exactly as it's supposed to?" Ethan looked down at her, feeling a sense of clarity beginning to form. He had been so focused on the possibility of failure that he had never considered the possibility of success, of growth, of change, of finding peace in the unknown. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about what might go wrong and start trusting in what could go right. The woman appeared then, her presence as calm and steady as ever. She walked up beside them and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've come so far," she said softly. "You've already made the hardest decision. Now, you just need to trust in the path ahead." Ethan looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. She had been there for him from the very beginning, guiding him with her quiet wisdom. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But for the first time, I'm not afraid to face it." The woman smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. "That's the key, Ethan," she said. "You've learned to trust, not just in the future, but in yourself. And that's what will carry you through." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know what would come next. He just needed to keep moving forward, trusting that each step would lead him to where he needed to be. The little girl took his hand then, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're ready," she said. "You've always been ready." Ethan smiled down at her, feeling a surge of hope rise in his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly ready to embrace whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer walking it alone. And that, he realized, was the most powerful thing of all. With the little girl by his side, and the woman who had guided him every step of the way, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew he could face it with courage, with trust, and with the love that had been so absent from his life before. And as they stood there together, under the starlit sky, Ethan knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. This was just the beginning, and he was ready to step into it fully, without hesitation. As time continued to pass, Ethan began to notice a shift in the way he moved through the world. The doubts that had once clouded his every decision started to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. The road ahead still felt uncertain, but instead of fearing the unknown, he welcomed it. The little girl and the woman had shown him that the most important thing wasn't having all the answers. It was about being open to the journey, trusting that each step would lead him exactly where he needed to be. Yet, even with all the progress he had made, there were moments when he felt a tug, a pull from the past, reminding him of the life he had left behind. His old self, the billionaire driven by ambition, success, and control, was still a part of him, and there were times when he wondered if he could fully escape it. One evening, as he sat at the small wooden table in the apartment, the woman entered the room, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She had been quiet lately, giving him the space to process everything he had been learning. But tonight, there was something different in the air. She sat across from him, her eyes warm but serious. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with the kind of care that only someone who truly understood could give. Ethan took a moment to answer. "I'm okay," he said slowly, his voice uncertain. "But there are times when I feel like I'm slipping back into old habits, old ways of thinking. The control, the need to fix everything, it's still there." The woman nodded, her expression calm. "That's normal," she said. "You've spent so much of your life living in a certain way that it's not easy to let go of it all at once. It takes time. But you've already taken the hardest steps. You've chosen to trust, to let go. That's not something that happens overnight." Ethan let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I know I've changed," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "But sometimes I still feel like I'm not doing enough. Like I'm not making a real difference." The woman smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to do everything, Ethan," she said. "You just need to show up, be present, and trust that what you're doing matters. Every small step you take is part of the bigger picture. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply be there for the people who need you." Ethan looked down, the weight of her words making him pause. "I never realized how much I had been missing," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on the future, on achieving more, that I've lost sight of the present." The woman reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "It's not too late to start living in the moment," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You have the power to create the life you want, but it starts with being present right here, right now." Ethan nodded, the truth of her words resonating deep within him. He had spent so many years trying to control his destiny, but now he understood that the key to living fully was to surrender to the journey. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to fix everything. He just needed to trust that things would unfold as they should. The little girl entered the room then, her eyes bright with excitement. "Are we going to do something fun today?" she asked, her voice full of energy. Ethan smiled, his heart lightening at her infectious enthusiasm. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, genuinely curious. The girl grinned and jumped up, taking his hand. "Come on, we're going on an adventure." Ethan chuckled, following her as she led him out of the apartment. They walked through the quiet streets, the sun shining brightly overhead. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The past no longer had a hold on him, and the future, once a source of anxiety, now seemed like an open road, waiting for him to take the next step. They arrived at a small park, where children were playing and laughing, their joy filling the air. The little girl ran off to join them, and Ethan watched her with a smile, his heart swelling with pride. She had helped him see the world in a way he never thought possible, and in turn, she had shown him that there was more to life than what he had once believed. As he stood there, watching the children play, Ethan realized that this was what mattered. These moments, these connections, these simple joys. The rest would come in time, but for now, he was content. The little girl came running back to him, her face lit up with excitement. "See? Isn't this fun?" she said, her voice full of innocence and happiness. Ethan smiled, bending down to her level. "It's perfect," he said, his heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad I'm here." The little girl's smile grew wider. "Me too," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Ethan nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. He wasn't trying to control anything anymore. He was simply living, being present, and trusting that everything would unfold as it was meant to. And in that moment, he realized that, for the first time, he was free. As the weeks passed, Ethan began to notice that the changes in his life were no longer subtle. The trust he had built in himself, in others, was beginning to manifest in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't that everything had become perfect, but it was real, and it felt right. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't running from the past or racing toward an uncertain future. He was simply present. Every morning when he woke up, the weight of anxiety that had once gripped his chest was absent. He had learned to accept the unknown and to embrace the unpredictability of life. He spent his days with the little girl, watching her grow and teaching him new ways of seeing the world. The woman, who had been with him from the beginning, continued to guide him, offering him wisdom when he needed it most. Together, the three of them had created something that felt like family, something deeper than anything Ethan had ever experienced before. Yet, with all of the growth, there was a moment that was fast approaching, a test of everything he had learned, everything he had come to trust. He wasn't sure when it would happen or how, but it was inevitable. One afternoon, as they sat in the small living room, the little girl was playing with a few toys, her laughter filling the space. Ethan and the woman sat together, talking quietly. The conversation was light at first, but Ethan could sense something was different in the air. The woman looked at him with a seriousness that he hadn't seen before. "There's something I need to tell you," she said gently, her voice tinged with both concern and reassurance. Ethan looked at her, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. "What is it?" he asked, his heart picking up pace, though he wasn't sure why. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "You've made so much progress, Ethan. But there will be a time soon when you're going to have to make a choice again. A choice about who you want to be in the world. It won't be easy." Ethan felt his pulse quicken, though he wasn't sure whether it was from fear or excitement. "What kind of choice?" he asked, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. "You've built a life for yourself, but the world will keep pushing at you," she said. "People will try to pull you back to who you were, to the things you used to chase. You'll face temptation. It's part of the journey. But now, you have something different to hold on to, something that's far stronger than anything you've ever known." Ethan nodded slowly, trying to absorb her words. He had always been a man of action, a man who thrived in the face of challenges. But this was different. He wasn't just facing a business deal or a test of his skills. This was about who he was deep down. The woman's eyes softened as she continued. "What you have now, this peace, this clarity, it's fragile, but it's real. Don't let anyone or anything take it away from you." Ethan looked at the little girl, who was still lost in her own world of play, her smile lighting up the room. He couldn't imagine losing this, losing the sense of connection he had found, but the fear crept in again. What if he wasn't strong enough to stay true to himself? "I don't want to go back to who I was," he said, his voice quiet, more to himself than to her. The woman nodded. "And you don't have to, but the world will test you. It will always try to pull you back to the person you were before. The temptation will come, but it's in your hands how you respond. It always has been." For a moment, there was silence. Ethan let her words sink in, trying to imagine what he would do if faced with the choice. He had come so far, but was he truly ready to stand firm in the face of everything he had left behind? The little girl looked up at them then, her eyes wide with innocent curiosity. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sweet and untainted by any of the doubt that Ethan was feeling. The woman smiled softly at her, the worry in her eyes disappearing for a moment. "We're talking about what comes next," she said. "How we keep moving forward, no matter what happens." Ethan smiled, his heart lifting slightly as he looked at the girl. Her innocence, her belief that everything would be okay, gave him strength. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It was about keeping faith, faith in himself, in the journey, and in the people who had walked beside him. The choice was his to make, but he didn't have to make it alone. "I'm ready," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. The woman looked at him, her expression proud but soft. "I know you are," she said. "And no matter what happens, you'll make the right choice." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the room, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had learned settling within him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk it. He didn't know what challenges awaited him, but he knew that with the strength of the little girl and the woman by his side, he was ready to face them. Together, they would face whatever came next, with trust, with love, and with the knowledge that the journey was worth everything. The days that followed felt like a test for Ethan, one that he wasn't quite sure he was ready for. The realization that his life was no longer dictated by the need for control was still something he was adjusting to. The little girl and the woman had taught him how to trust, how to live in the moment, but there were still whispers of doubt that crept into his mind when he was alone. It wasn't that he didn't believe in the change. It was more that he couldn't fully let go of the man he had been for so long. The outside world still expected him to be the same person he had once been. The successful businessman, the one who had it all together, who made decisions and stuck by them, who was always in control. The demands were starting to pile up again, the familiar calls and emails reminding him of the life he had left behind. But now, instead of diving into the chaos, he felt a growing sense of resistance. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the facade of pretending to be someone he wasn't. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult phone call, Ethan found himself pacing the small living room. He felt the weight of the past pressing down on him again, a familiar suffocating feeling that had once been a constant companion. The woman, who had been watching him with concern, stood up from the chair by the window and walked toward him. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan paused, looking at her, and then let out a deep sigh. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I feel like I'm being pulled back into everything I've been trying to escape. It's like the world doesn't want me to let go." The woman nodded, her expression understanding. "It's not easy to change," she said softly. "The world will always pull at you, always try to bring you back to where you were. But the key is to remember why you started this journey in the first place." Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowing. "I started because I wanted something real," he said quietly. "Something that mattered more than success or money or control." The woman smiled, a small but reassuring smile. "Exactly. And that's what you have now. You've built something different. It's not the life you left behind, and it's not going to be perfect. But it's yours." Ethan let the words sink in. He had come so far, and yet, he still struggled with the fear of falling back into old habits. But now, for the first time, he realized that the real test wasn't whether or not he could change. It was whether he could stay true to who he had become. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice filled with conviction. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and grounding. "You won't. But you need to be prepared for the challenges ahead. There will always be distractions, always be temptations to slip back into old patterns. The real challenge is learning to face them and still stay true to the path you've chosen." Ethan nodded slowly. The woman was right. He had made the choice to change, to live in a way that was authentic to himself. And now, he had to fight to protect that. He had to fight for the life he had built, for the people who mattered, for the future he wanted. The little girl appeared at the doorway, her face bright with energy. "What are you guys talking about?" she asked, her curiosity evident. Ethan smiled at her, his heart lifting at the sight of her innocence and joy. "Just figuring things out," he said, his voice lighter now. The woman glanced at him and nodded. "You're doing well," she said, her tone warm. "But the real work is just beginning." Ethan looked at the little girl, his heart full of gratitude. She had helped him see the world differently, helped him find a new path, one that was built on trust, love, and connection, rather than control and ambition. And for that, he would always be grateful. But he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but he had the strength to face them. He had already taken the first step by trusting, by letting go of the need to control everything. And now, he had to keep walking forward, step by step, knowing that every moment, every choice, was leading him toward the life he truly wanted. The little girl's smile grew wider as she skipped over to him. "Come on, let's go do something fun," she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the door. Ethan laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, letting her lead him out the door, feeling the warmth of her joy. "You'll see," she replied, her voice filled with excitement. As they walked down the street, hand in hand, Ethan realized that this was it, the life he had been searching for. Not the life of power and success, not the life of control and fear, but a life of connection, of love, and of being present in every moment. It was a simple life, but it was the one he had always needed. And with each step, he felt more certain that this was the right path. The challenges would come, but he was ready to face them. With the little girl by his side, and the woman who had guided him, he knew he was not only capable of meeting the future head-on, but that he was ready to live it fully, whatever came next. The weeks that followed continued to stretch forward, and for Ethan, each day brought new lessons, new realizations. He had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life, to trust in the journey instead of worrying about the destination. The little girl's presence in his life remained a steady reminder of the simplicity of being present, of taking each day as it came. It wasn't always easy. Old habits died hard, and there were moments when the pull of his old life, the world of business and control, whispered to him, tempting him to return. But with each passing day, the whispers grew fainter, replaced by the sound of his own heart, steady and sure. One morning, after a long night of thoughts that had kept him awake, Ethan stood by the window in his small apartment. The city spread out before him, a maze of roads and buildings, each with its own story. He had spent so many years being a part of that world, but now, looking out at it, he saw it differently. It wasn't just a collection of businesses and opportunities anymore. It was a world full of people, each one living their own life, each one trying to find their own peace. He took a deep breath, feeling the quiet peace that had settled within him. The noise of the city seemed distant now, as though it belonged to another life, one he had once lived, but was no longer a part of. He didn't need to be that man anymore. The man who was constantly chasing, who was never satisfied, who was always reaching for the next thing. He had what he needed now. He had the love of those around him. The little girl appeared at the doorway, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice as light as ever, though there was an understanding in her gaze that belied her age. Ethan smiled, turning to face her. "Just about how far I've come," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And how much I've learned." She smiled back at him, her eyes sparkling. "You've come a long way," she said. "You're not the same person you were when I first met you." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling. "I'm not," he said softly, "but I'm learning to be the person I'm supposed to be." The woman, who had quietly entered the room behind them, smiled. "That's the most important part," she said. "Learning to be yourself, not the person you thought you had to be." Ethan's heart warmed at her words. She had been his guide, his anchor, throughout this entire journey. Her steady presence had helped him more than he could ever express. The little girl skipped over to him and took his hand. "You're doing great," she said, her voice full of encouragement. Ethan looked down at her, his smile growing. "Thanks," he said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you." The girl beamed, her small hand still holding his. "You did it yourself," she said. "I just helped you remember what you already knew." Ethan knelt down to her level, his heart full of love and appreciation. "I'll never forget this," he said softly. "I'll never forget what you've taught me." She smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "You won't," she said, "because it's not something you learn. It's something you remember." Ethan stood up slowly, feeling a sense of peace that he had never known before. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly living. Not just existing, but living. Each moment felt real, full of meaning, full of connection. The weight that had once been so heavy, the pressure to succeed, to be the best, had lifted. He wasn't running anymore. He was here, in the present, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've done well," she said softly. "But remember, this journey doesn't have an end. It's a continuous process. There will always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But as long as you keep trusting, keep moving forward, you'll be fine." Ethan nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle within him. He had come so far, but this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of it. He was ready to face whatever came next. With the little girl and the woman by his side, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that was enough. He didn't need anything else. Together, they walked out of the apartment, the bright sun shining down on the street before them. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Free from the expectations, free from the pressure, free to be himself. And as they walked down the street, hand in hand, Ethan knew that he had found something more valuable than all the wealth in the world. He had found peace. And that was all he needed. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ethan's life continued to unfold in ways he had never imagined. The peace he had found within himself became his constant companion. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the old world he had left behind tried to pull him back, but now, those moments were fleeting. The little girl, who had once guided him with her simple but profound wisdom, was still by his side. She had shown him the path, but he had walked it himself. The woman, who had always been there to support him, had become more than just a mentor. She had become a friend, a confidant, someone who understood him in ways no one else ever had. Ethan no longer felt like he was fighting the world. He wasn't chasing success or controlling every aspect of his life. He had let go of the need to prove himself. He had accepted that the journey was enough, that the moments were enough. He had become present in a way he never thought possible. One evening, after spending the day together, the little girl turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet knowing. "You've changed," she said, her voice soft but filled with meaning. Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I have, haven't I?" he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "And I'm not done changing. I don't think I ever will be." The little girl nodded, her smile wide. "That's the best part," she said. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep being you." Ethan laughed softly, the sound full of ease. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. The woman, who had been quietly observing them, walked over and sat beside them. "You're doing just fine," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that made Ethan feel safe. "You're exactly where you need to be." Ethan looked at the two of them, his heart swelling with appreciation. He had never known this kind of peace before. He had never known what it felt like to truly belong, to be loved for who he was, not what he could do. The little girl reached up, taking his hand in hers. "We're here with you," she said softly, her voice filled with a sense of certainty. "You don't have to do it alone." Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart full. "I know," he said, "and I'm so grateful for that." The woman smiled at him, her gaze steady and full of pride. "You've come so far," she said. "You've learned what it means to live, to trust, to love, and most importantly, to be true to yourself." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he had been missing until he had found it. He had spent so many years chasing something he thought would fill the emptiness. But now he knew that the emptiness had always been a reflection of his own fears and doubts. He had to let go of them to find peace. "I don't know what the future holds," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know that I'm ready for it, ready to face whatever comes next." The little girl smiled brightly. "And you'll be great," she said. "Because you're already great." Ethan felt his heart swell with pride, and for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't have everything figured out, but he was enough. He was enough for himself. He was enough for them. Together, they had created something beautiful. It wasn't about the past, about what he had lost or left behind. It was about the present, about the people who loved him, and about the life they were building together. The world outside the window, with its endless possibilities and challenges, no longer seemed daunting. It felt like a world he was ready to engage with, a world where he could truly make a difference. He wasn't doing it alone anymore. He had found his place, and he knew that he could face whatever the future held. The little girl and the woman had helped him see that the most important thing wasn't to control everything or to have all the answers. It was to trust the journey, to trust the people who cared, and to be present in the life that was unfolding. With that realization, Ethan stood up, holding the little girl's hand in his, the woman by his side. They stepped into the world together, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The journey had only just begun, but for the first time, Ethan was ready to walk it with his heart open, free from the past, and filled with hope for the future. In this captivating tale, the journey of self-discovery unfolds through the lens of a transformative relationship, where the protagonist finds peace, understanding, and connection in ways he never imagined. As the story progresses, the main character sheds the old identity built on control and success, slowly discovering the true value of vulnerability and trust. The deep wisdom shared by those around him, particularly the little girl and the woman, reveals a heartfelt narrative in these Black stories, showcasing the power of personal growth and the importance of human connection. Each step taken is filled with life lessons that resonate with anyone who has ever searched for meaning beyond material success. Through heartfelt moments, emotional breakthroughs, and the subtle beauty of everyday life, This story unfolds in a way that reflects the core of Black stories, revealing a deeper understanding of the complexities of relationships, fear, love, and inner peace. With themes of trust, self-acceptance, and hope, the Black stories shared in this narrative provide a powerful reminder that the most significant changes happen when we stop running from ourselves and start embracing the moments that truly matter. In the end, the protagonist realizes that life is not about perfection, but about the journey of becoming who you are meant to be. The Black stories throughout this tale come together in a way that makes each moment feel both deeply personal and universally relatable, reminding us all that the path forward often begins with letting go and simply trusting the process.